Give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since the previous Security Council meeting on Ukraine a month ago, we have managed to make significant progress in achieving the objectives set for the special military operation. With the taking of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Russian armed forces and the formations of the People's Republics have fully liberated the territory of the LPR. The steady movement into DPR is continuing. In total, within the republics, 255 towns and villages have been liberated, and it's only a matter of time before their full territory returns to the control of the population of Donbass. The internet has been filled with video clips of how in liberated Lysychansk, the people living there came out onto the streets and met Russian forces and the forces of the People's Militia with St. George's ribbons and with Russian flags. I would suggest that all those who have grown tired over all this time of Ukrainian propaganda fairy tales about the Russian army that is allegedly terrorizing the local population, I would suggest that you look at these videos showing the reactions of real people, their tears of joy when they were at last able to leave their shelters and no longer needed to fear Ukrainian nationalists. The reconstruction of the liberated territories is proceeding apace. Thanks to our efforts, normal life is returning to Mariupol, where central water supply has been restored and electricity is being restored as well. In LPR, work has begun on the construction of a major water pipeline, and in Lugansk itself, a multifunctional medical center is being built. The cruelty of the Ukrainian nationalists, their indifference to those living in the south and east of Ukraine, has had a serious impact on the mood in these regions. In Zaporozhye and Kherson oblasts, people are lining up to receive Russian passports. Despite the fact that Ukrainian authorities are trying to do everything they can to intimidate their citizens and carrying out terrorist attacks against those working for the city administration and initiating criminal proceedings for people moving over to Russian citizenship, people are choosing the country that they trust. They're choosing a normal future for themselves and their children. Ukraine is losing these people before its eyes, just as in the past it lost the residents of Donbass, against whom the Kiev regime in 2014 began a war of annihilation. The Kiev regime is trying to get vengeance even on its own service personnel, who have acknowledged the pointlessness of carrying out these criminal orders and are giving themselves up to have a chance of a peaceful life. This morning, from HIMARS, somewhere near Yelenevsk in Donbass was shelled from these weapons received from the United States, as a result of which more than 50 Ukrainian prisoners were killed. However, this act of intimidation only incites the mobilization and the motivation of Ukrainians to give themselves up. Mass cases of refusal to fight from among Ukrainian army soldiers are things we are seeing on a daily basis. A significant role in this change in mood that I mentioned among those living in the south of Ukraine is being played by the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces are continuing their favorite tactic of using civilian infrastructure as shelters and places to deploy their heavy materiel. This attitude of the Kiev regime to their own people is testified to by dozens of witnesses who, unlike the so-called witnesses from the Ukrainian and Western investigations, aren't afraid to show their names and their addresses. They are pointing to targeted strikes by the Ukrainian armed forces on civilian objects and the shooting of civilians, which are then presented as the actions of Russian forces. These stagings, such as just like the infamous Bucha, are increasingly being refuted, and it's almost impossible to ignore that. It's only our Western colleagues who are not taking any notice of this, and we've become very aware of that, including at this meeting. Our British colleague gave an exhaustive list of these provocations. Thank you very much for doing that. Mr. President, in the past month, we have seen progress when it comes to the export of Ukrainian grain and also the access of Russian products and fertilizer to global markets. On the 22nd of July in Istanbul, 2 separate documents were signed on this, which make up a package agreement. I would like to underscore that we were prepared to resolve these issues back in April after they were discussed at the meeting in Moscow between President Vladimir Putin and Antonio Guterres. But Kiev and its Western backers tried to sabotage the package nature of the agreements, overemphasizing only the part that related to Ukrainian grain. And this is even though, according to our data, this amounts to only around 5 million tons. That is to say, less than 1% of the total amount of grain on global markets. We thank the UN Secretary General and Turkey for not acting at the behest of the Western camp, which in large part allowed these agreements to be reached. The signing of the Russia-UN memorandum on supporting getting Russian food products onto global markets once again indicates that it is absolutely inappropriate to try and blame our country for the global food crisis that has been artificially created by the actions of Western states, and signs of which we are seeing ever more evidently. On the 26th of July, the Joint Coordination Center for the Safe Transport of Grain from Ukrainian ports began operating with the involvement of participants of Russia, Turkey, and Ukraine, and with the involvement of UN staff. We trust that soon the Istanbul agreements will begin to be implemented in full, and the Secretary General, in accordance with the obligations that he has made, will do everything he can to alleviate barriers created by the United States and the EU in the area of payments, insurance, and logistics for Russian freight. Incidentally, the deployment of military goods and hardware in the port of Odessa is hardly going to do anything to support the implementation of these agreements, and we will continue to destroy these goods and objects as we did on the 23rd of July when Harpoon anti-ship rockets supplied by the United States were destroyed. Nothing in this memorandum prevents us from continuing to ensure the demilitarization of Ukraine. Mr. President, in the past month, the West's proxy war with Russia, down to the very last Ukrainian, was ratcheted up yet again, with the beginning of active deliveries to the Ukraine regime of modern MLRSs that are being used under the direction of and direct control of Western instructors. It led to the direct involvement of Western countries in the conflict. Satellite images for the use of organizing strikes are willingly being provided to Kiev by so-called private Western companies, and we have repeatedly seen how these images are being used for various sorts of stagings and provocations. Of course, we cannot ignore that fact. And as for the weapons provided to Kiev and the mercenaries that remain on the territory of Ukraine, they will continue to be destroyed by the Russian armed forces as a legitimate military target. The thoughtless ploughing of heavy weapons, artillery systems, and firearms into Ukraine will mean that because of the flourishing corruption among Ukraine's political and military leadership, those weapons will spill over into Europe. We know that a large part of that is falling into the hands of smugglers right from the storehouses. There are established channels for supplying them then to the black market for weapons. On websites, almost publicly, information about this is being published about the fact that these weapons are available. The problem has reached such a scale that it can no longer be ignored, even by the leading Western media. Even Europol has been forced to acknowledge this. Last week, its representative, Jan Opken-Ort, commenting to the DPA agency, reported that Europol was aware of reports of the trafficking in heavy weapons, and also the fact that European law enforcement agencies have information about people leaving the territory of Ukraine with firearms. He also underscored that there was still a risk of all of this falling into the hands of organized criminal groups or terrorists. In a number of media outlets, there are leaks from the confidential part of Europol's report submitted to the European Council. It notes that criminal networks are smuggling a significant amount of firearms and ammunition from Ukraine to EU countries. According to the assessments of Europol, along the Ukrainian border with the EU, weapons caches have been created. A clear illustration of these conclusions is the result of the joint operation of the law enforcement agencies of Hungary and Slovakia to detain a criminal group that was smuggling weapons delivered to Ukraine. A whole arsenal, including sniper rifles, machine guns, and explosives, was discovered in Rijeka in Hungary, just an hour's drive from the main disarmament platform in Vienna. Upon the admittance of one of those detained, these weapons were delivered to Ukraine, intended for the Ukrainian armed groups, including the Azov battalion, and were then sold and delivered to the territory of the European Union. I would like to ask our Western colleagues, are you actually aware of the consequences of what you're doing? We're starting to have doubts over that. Because with your own hands, you're creating in the center of Europe a regional and possibly even a global hub for the illegal supply of weapons. In so doing, creating real risks for your population and also at the expense of your own taxpayers. And don't tell us that we didn't warn you when the weapons that you supplied to Ukraine show up, for example, in a conflict zone in one of the countries in another region of the world and are used against UN peacekeepers. Or if they're used by extremists in Europe itself for a terrorist attack. All of your attempts to supply the Ukrainian regime with weapons are only dragging out its agony and increasing the suffering of the Ukrainian people, being used by the current irresponsible leaders of the country as cannon fodder. The aims of our special military operation will be achieved either way, however much fuel you pour onto the fire in the form of weapons. Mr. President, during July, our Western colleagues tried to ignore the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces actively used foreign-produced explosive-laden drones for attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. As a result of the attack on the 20th of July on the territory of the power station, a fire started, and it was only through a happy accident that a major accident was avoided, the consequences of which would have been felt by all Europeans. I would like to underscore that we're talking here about a targeted attack, an intentional attack of the Ukrainian armed forces against a nuclear facility, the largest nuclear power station in Europe. The problem was resolved, and the station continues now to work normally under the control of Russian forces. In all of this, we are most shocked by the monstrous hypocrisy of the Western countries, who didn't comment at all on the irrational provocation of the Kiev regime. And yet, back in March at a Security Council meeting, they whipped up hysteria around the alleged radiological threat that was allegedly created by shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power station by Russian forces, despite the fact that the IAEA Director General publicly refuted that. Quite frankly, this is very reminiscent of the criminal blindness that Western countries demonstrated when 7 years ago they provided cover to Kiev for the non-implementation of the Minsk agreements. It's tragic that this blindness and double standards is now being demonstrated by the UN's leadership as well. This irresponsible approach is only encouraging the Kiev regime to take further steps that undermine nuclear security on our continent. Mr. President, I would like to draw the attention of Western delegations to the fact that the long-range artillery provided by you is allowing the Ukrainian armed forces to reach areas behind the lines in Donbass and without any military logic and exclusively for the purposes of vengeance and terror to kill civilians. By way of targets in Donetsk, Kherson, Stakhanov and Gorlovka, the Kiev regime is choosing schools, hospitals and residential buildings. Almost every day in Donbass, shelling from long-range systems received from NATO countries, from 5 to 10 people die and dozens are wounded. It's just the Western and Ukrainian media that aren't seeing this, but that won't make these crimes any less horrific. By supplying Ukraine with long-range artillery, the West is becoming directly complicit in the war crimes of the Kiev regime. It is particularly painful when Ukrainian shelling kills children. Donbass has been regularly burying them for 8 years, since the beginning of the Ukrainian punitive military operation in the region. The day before yesterday, on the 27th of July, in DPR, there was a day of memory for the child victims of the war in Donbass. On that day, those living in Donetsk laid flowers and brought toys to the memorial on the Alley of the Angels. During a minute of silence, there was quiet in the city, which was not broken even by the sound of artillery, even though shelling from the Ukrainian armed forces had been conducted that day from the morning. That day wasn't chosen by accident. On the 27th of July 2014, in Gorlovka, outside Donetsk, during shelling by Ukrainian forces, Kira Zhuk died together with her mother, and she wasn't even a year old at the time. I'm holding up her photograph now. Together with her, another 4 children died that day. They were among the first victims of the war that Kiev was waging against Donbass, which has continued for 8 years. In their memory, in Donetsk, the Alley of Angels was set up with a monument bearing the names of children killed by Ukraine. There are now 130 names there. They include, for example, 13-year-old Anastasia Konoplyova, whose photograph I'm holding up now. She died from shelling in 2015, together with her brother and sister in their apartment. Unfortunately, this terrible list is regularly added to. Since February, in DPR alone, 249 civilians have died, including 16 children. I want you to look at the photograph of 10-year-old Veronika Badina, who died on the 5th of July from Ukrainian armed forces shelling in Donetsk, and 7-year-old Masha Yevtukhova, who died on the 6th of July at a playground together with 3 of her peers. I'm intentionally showing you their photos not just because Ukraine killed them in this same month, but they, like 3 other children, died from shells that were launched from Western artillery systems. Before the Ukrainian armed forces received those systems, they simply could not reach those areas, and now they can. And do you know what, on that evening after the Ukrainian armed forces killed 5 children in a row, what Ukrainian President Zelensky said? Do you think he expressed condolences to the parents who had lost that which was most dear to them? No. Allow me to cite his statement. Beginning of the quote. At last, we can feel that this powerful Western artillery has been brought to bear, that weapon that we've received from our partners. It is indeed as accurate as needed. End quote. I turn now to my American, British, and French colleagues sitting in this room. I want you to clearly understand this. From weapons that your countries provided to Ukraine, paid for by money from your taxpayers, children are being killed. And the president of this country is openly sneering at this and boasting about the accuracy of those weapons. Is that what you were trying to achieve? Because if not, where are your words condemning this unheard of sacrilege? Some in this room probably thought that the Ukrainian regime was killing children in Donbass unintentionally, and that their deaths, to use the terminology of our former American partners, was rather the side effect, a collateral damage, of military activities. I'm afraid I have to disappoint you on that front, and I'll show you another photograph. Do you know what this is? This is a Lipistok mine, remotely activated, which is now actively being dropped over Donbass and sprinkled over Donbass as a cluster munition by Ukrainian forces. It's unique in that it's the size of the palm of your hand. It's almost invisible on the ground, and it looks a lot like a children's toy. If you touch it or if you step on it, it goes off. It would maim an adult, but it would almost certainly kill a child. So answer me, please. Why drop these fatal toys deep behind the lines in civilian, peaceful towns? And the answer is obvious. That is, to kill as many children as possible. This cruelty might give one pause, but those who were present at our 2 most recent informal area formula Security Council meetings on Ukraine will understand fully that the roots of this hatred towards those living in the south and east of Ukraine lie in the ideology of Ukrainian nationalism and neo-Nazism. The world will learn about many more unpleasant truths about these horrible phenomena that the Western backers of Ukraine prefer to ignore. And this is the clear result of your blindness. Distinguished colleagues, after having shown you these photos of children, I think I don't even need to say anymore that the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine will be carried out in full. There must no longer be a threat from this state to Donbass, nor to Russia, nor to the liberated Ukrainian territories, where, for the first time in several years, people are finally able to feel that they can live the way they want. In conclusion, I'd once again like to turn to our Western colleagues. By supplying long-range artillery systems and MLRSs to Ukraine, you are essentially shifting what is needed for the peaceful development of these regions, that is to say, the provisional security line. You're shifting it further towards the west, and in so doing, clarifying even further the aims and objectives of our special military operation. Think about this, and also think about how, once it's over, one way or another, you will have to live alongside us and cooperate with us. And you are now in large part creating the conditions for that stage yourselves. And believe me when I say that your readiness to help the Ukrainians kill the children of Donetsk and Lugansk will hardly be forgotten both by the Ukrainian and Russian people. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement.